Hi, my name is Jay, this is a camera test. I am going to be talking about the book that I'm writing, just listing out some of the characters, basically just doing a bit of a brain dump, because I've been keeping everything in a big Word document, and it's getting a bit clunky, so I just want to say everything out loud, so I have it for myself. If you want to stay and listen and get some character inspiration, or if you have any tips based on what you hear in this video, I'd love to hear it. Yeah, so here we go. So my book is based on two Edwardian archaeologists, a husband and a wife called Robert and Louise. Robert is an archaeologist. He was pressured by his dad to become an archaeologist because his dad also did it. It's a family trade essentially. Louise's father was an astronomer, so she became an archaeoastronomer, studying how the stars influence the building of ancient temples and tombs and things like that. So you know how the pyramids were all built aligned to certain stars. It's all really interesting to me, so I decided to have a character who was really interested in that, basically to give me an excuse to do more research into it. So I did briefly study archaeoastronomy for this. Wasn't quite so good at the math side of it, and my telescope's not really good enough to actually practice anything I've researched, but you know, it's all good fun in theory. And I think that's the most important thing to me about my book, is going to be that I enjoy the research that I'm doing, because there's going to be a lot of it. I'm about 20,000 words into the book already. I've done my entire outline. I know what's going to happen plot-wise. I just need to do some research to be able to place the characters more into their social context. So I know I'm learning loads and loads about ancient Egypt. I've already done plenty of research for that. It's now a case of learning about the Edwardians and learning about how a late Victorian, early Edwardian person would react to certain places, to certain situations they were put in, because Robert is certainly put in a situation. But I'm also researching a lot about life in ancient Egypt, which is very interesting to me. I mean, some of the research that I've been doing has been pretty, I don't want to say hands-on, because I haven't really had the chance to go to Egypt and, you know, look at any tombs or anything like that, but I travelled to London January with the express intention of researching for my book. So I went to the British Museum and I went to the Pietri Museum as well, which is part of the University of London. Pietri was a founding father of Egyptology, essentially. He and his team made hundreds of discoveries in Egypt, and they have a very comprehensive museum down in London. While I was in the Pietri Museum, I spoke to a girl in there who's, unfortunately I didn't get her name, so if it was you, thank you. But I spoke to this girl and she told me all about Amelia Edwards, who wrote the book 1,000 Miles Down the Nile? Up the Nile? Up the Nile, I think. Which is essentially a travel diary by Amelia Edwards. Has done loads for women in archaeology herself, but it was pointed out to me while I was at the museum. Her and her husband were both big believers in eugenics, which is why I've decided that I think my main character flaw, for her at least, to fit in with the times that Louise has written, will be issues of her own prejudices, so not necessarily just race. Again, I'm not going to spoil too much of my book, but there's a few different things going on, a few characters from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different personal beliefs, and when you stick the most straight, white, upper-class Edwardian woman in the middle of it, she doesn't appreciate that very much. So her main character arc is going to be revolving around that, while Robert's is essentially him going to be picked up from his Edwardian life and dropped off in ancient Egypt. So he's struggling with feeling just completely out of his depth. He has to learn the language, he has to learn all about the culture, take part in their rituals. So the two friends that Robert makes when he goes to Egypt is an architect and a priest. And Robert knows nothing about, I mean, he knows a fair bit about Egyptian religion because of the nature of his archaeology, but actually being there and being in practice is completely different to him, and he needs to learn basically all there is to know so that he can fit in with all the people who already live there. Because obviously, from what we can speculate about ancient Egyptian life, their religion was extremely important to them. You know, the religion and politics was one and the same. The Pharaoh was chosen by the gods. Religion was day-to-day life to them, as it is to many people now. So Robert learns to blend in more with the religion and to kind of in a similar way to Louise, he is learning to accept that other people have religions, and he needs to not necessarily be on board with them, but allow them to coexist. And at the same time, he also causes his friends to kind of question their own beliefs, because here is a man that they believe is sent by the gods, and he's saying, those aren't real gods. And they're going, oh, maybe they're not. You know, if he was sent by a god, he must know better. So it's quite fun so far, putting my priest character through a religious crisis. Basically, I like torturing people. In my books, not in real life. I promise. They're both upper class, born into science families, so they already have their foot in the door when it comes to things like being part of scientific, you know, royal societies and explorers and things like this. Robert and Louise are digging in Egypt. They have a big fight one day because Robert wants to go and dig a little further north, Louise wants to go and dig further to the east, and they can't decide between them where they're going to go. So they have a huge row. Robert takes Bahiti, and the two of them go off and dig in one place, and Louise takes Edward, and the two of them start studying star charts and decide we need to dig here, and like find their own place. And when Louise and Edward finally come to the conclusion they've found the perfect place to dig and they know exactly where this temple is going to be, they go to find Robert. They find Bahiti back at their camp, and he goes, oh, Robert's still, he's back at the temple. And Louise and Edward kind of look at each other and go, what temple? So Bahiti goes, yeah, we found a temple, you know, go have a look. So they come to a hole in the ground, and she slips down inside, and sure enough, there is a temple underground, a bit bigger and more maze-like than she'd anticipated, and she decides to go through and have a look for her husband, apologise for fighting with him about his instincts, tell him that she thinks she's also found something and it might be worth digging there, but obviously he's the head of the dig, and if he wants to continue digging here, then she has to go along with it. And when she gets there, she can't find him. Bahiti insists that he's definitely down here in this temple, and no one else has seen him since they came out of the temple. So he must be down there. So Louise can't find her husband anywhere. She looks around the rooms of this temple, she's calling out for him. He's not responding, there's no lamplight anywhere. So she worries that he's knocked himself out, you know, maybe part of the roof caved in and collapsed over him, something like that. So she, Bahiti and Edward decide to explore the tomb, go and find Robert, and bring him back safe. So the three of them explore this temple, they're looking for Robert, and instead of finding him anywhere, what they do find is this really worn out old diary. And it's very obviously Robert's diary. So they find Robert's diary, but it's a lot more brittle and a lot more worn than they remember. Louise opens it up to a page and realises that her husband's handwriting has changed. And she's like, this is really odd, you know, maybe he frantically wrote this before whatever bad happened to him. But as she starts to read it, and the page is slightly crumbling, she realises how old this book is, and finds that it's actually a book from 2,000 years ago, written fully in English, and it's Robert's, it's definitely Robert's. And the rest of the book is her, Edward and Bahiti trying to find out how to get Robert back from the past. So Robert's half of the book is him trying to get back to the future without the DeLorean, but along the way also learning valuable lessons about his own life from the ancient Egyptians. So I've written this book as a lesson for my two characters, essentially. Louise learns that in order to be accepted as an equal member of society, rather than being oppressed as a woman, she needs to learn to accept others, so she needs to stop being a racist. Whereas Robert learns that he needs to stop being the oppressor. You know, he was oppressed by his father and forced into work that he didn't want to do, and now he's doing exactly the same thing to his wife. He's forcing her out of the job that she really wants to do because she's a woman. So it's all about learning to stick up for themselves, learning to follow their own passions, and not to worry so much about what other people think, which I think is a really important message in life. There's definitely going to be some other lessons going on for the other characters. Edward needs to learn that humans are more important than knowledge. He tends to put everything before himself and everyone around him, and it can really rub off on other people. Like someone like Sherlock Holmes really annoys people, rubs them the wrong way when he's trying to do his research. I want Edward to come across like that. On the other hand, Bahiti's lesson is a lot more about learning to be more in touch with his own history. So back in the Edwardian times, a lot of local labourers would sell out their own sites to the British or whoever was digging up at the time, and basically sell off their own valuables and their own cultural history for money, which Bahiti was definitely guilty of doing in my book. So he's going to learn to appreciate his own culture more. Again, I'm not going to push too hard on issues like that, because obviously I'm not from a culture where that's necessarily been an issue, because I'm from England, and as well as stealing everyone else's history, we have most of our own still here. So it's definitely going to be something that I talk to people about. I'm not just going to go into this and act as if I know everything about everyone's history, obviously. I do think that's an important subject to touch on. The damage archaeology has done is going to be the most deep-rooted theme in my book. It's definitely something that resonated with me when I started learning about it, so I wanted that to be a constant theme throughout my book. So back in time, you've got Nagtre, who's the priest, Hekaib, who's the architect, and you've got Hatshepsut, who is of course the pharaoh at the time, and Thutmose is going to be sort of a fairly young child at this point. So she's also a mother at the time. Obviously she's a mother the whole time he's alive, but she's much more of a hands-on mother when he's a little kid. So I want Nagtre to focus a lot more on his crisis of religion, where he believes that Robert was sent to him by the god Thoth. And when Robert arrives in Egypt and starts going, well, no, Christ is our Lord and Saviour, Nagtre believes that this person who was sent to him by the gods must be telling the truth, because he was sent by the gods. So he goes through a lot trying to process it. And then when Robert learns to stop forcing his own opinions on others, he says the same thing to Nagtre and is like, believe what you want to believe, what you need to believe, what helps you get through it. So he ultimately reverts to his religion and decides it makes him happy, because it's what he's dedicated his entire life to. Whereas Hekaib, on the other hand, is going to be an architect, as I said, and his dream is to build for the pharaoh. So it was a lucky connection that Robert ended up meeting him. Because of Robert's divine intervention, the pharaoh takes great interest in him, and he just happens to be in the same region as Hekaib at the time, who is then connected to the pharaoh, and his whole character revolves around how at first he put in no work. I mean, he built a few things for his own community to try and kind of put his name out there, but the second he met Robert, and Robert met Hatshepsut, he thought, great, I'm in there, I don't need to put any more effort in. And he kind of learns that just because you start to make progression in life doesn't mean you have to stop putting the effort in. And he basically learns to follow his dreams, which sounds a bit cringy, but within the context of the book, I'm hoping it won't be. Okay, so this book is going to be written in kind of a diary format, so I like to think of it as being written in a similar way on Louisa's part to Amelia Edwards' book. Because she's my main inspiration for Louisa's character, I think it's important I give her a really distinct voice. So I want to take some elements from Amelia Edwards' book in the way that she speaks and kind of put that into Louisa's writing at the same time. While on the other hand, Robert is going to be written, to me, a lot more like Jonathan Harker's entries into Dracula. Because I really like the idea of him being placed in this kind of fantasy gothic world in the same way as Jonathan Harker, so I want to try and utilise some of the language, some of the emotions that he feels during Dracula. That's a big inspiration for that, and it's a similar timeline, because Dracula's Victorian, obviously. It's only a few decades before this is set. It's very important to me that my characters have good dynamics with each other. I tend to write character before I write story. I tend to do things a bit backwards. My ideal dynamic between the characters is this kind of triangle. Who can I compare it to? Kirk, Spock and Bones. of course. So you've got like the leader who kind of wants to take action, go for it, be brave, be strong, which for the sake of this is going to be Louise. Then you've got the logical and the emotional, who kind of sit on the captain's shoulders, you know, and say, this is what you should be doing to make the situation better, and this is what you should be doing to make people feel better, and they usually have conflict. So the logical one is going to be Edward, while the emotional one will be Bahiti, for example. Or if we go back in time, then you've got the leader, which is Robert, is the Kirk of the situation. You've got Natre is the Spock, and then Hekaib is the Bones, and they make this distinct... It's my favourite kind of dynamic, where you've got this one conflicted person and then two people sitting on their shoulders saying completely opposite things. So it is, it's definitely important to me that I have some input from the other characters as well, clearly showing through in my characters' decisions. And I think the best way for me personally to interpret that and write it out is through the form of the diary. So I've got Louise going, oh my god, you won't believe what Bahiti said to me today, showing that she's clearly thinking about what they're doing and what they're saying without me having to expressly write, you know, show don't tell kind of thing. To me that is just easier as a diary format. Although that as a rule itself is something that's a bit up in the air for me at the moment, because when I'm reading Amelia's book, a lot of it is telling. We did this, we went here, we did that, because it's a book written by an explorer about what she's exploring. So it will be interesting to write my book and then break the rules of my own book depending on how I think an Edwardian would have written it. But I think that's part of the challenge of writing for me, so that's definitely something I'll enjoy. So as well as reading 1,000 Miles Up the Nile... Is it up the Nile? I'm actually going to Google it. I need to know before I say it wrong again. 1,000 miles up. 1,000 miles up the Nile. So I work full time, but I have a lot of downtime during my work, so I tend to spend that time reading books, basically. Don't tell the boss. But I've been reading quite a few books to help me source information for my own book. For example, I've been reading An Account of Egypt by Herodotus, so that to me has been so interesting. Whether you take it as factual or not is debatable, because he was an ancient Greek historian. So he was around in later Egypt than I'm writing about, but it's still been really helpful for me to read his book to give me an example of how daily life in, you know, day-to-day Egypt would have been back then. He writes a lot about different religious festivities, how different boats looked, you know, that was a really weird example, but yeah, he really writes about loads of different aspects of ancient Egyptian life and documents it for people back in Greece. And again, you have to take it with a pinch of salt, just because the Greeks like to flourish. But it's definitely really interesting just to get another perspective on it from someone else of the time period. So an ancient Greek who left his homeland and came to stay in Egypt for a while, well, it's not as big of a jump as Robert goes through. It's still a big jump for Herodotus. So it was a real person, but it's another real person that I could draw from for my character's experiences. So I'm also reading The Woman Who Would Be King by Karakuni. This is a book about Hatshepsut and her rise to power, and how she's misinterpreted a lot by historians as kind of an evil power-grabbing woman. Kara puts forward the argument that it's a case of women just being a good ruler, but then being accused of being too vicious, I suppose would be the right word. So if you get a great military leader, someone like Alexander, if he takes over half the known world, he's a hero. Look at all of his accomplishments. But when Hatshepsut had this great army and was taking over plenty of land and gathering loads of resources for her country, she was a great military leader. But it was pretty much erased from history, partially by her ancestors who etched her name. You know, her son etched her name out of most of her engravings, just to bury her name completely, and nobody's quite sure why, which is something else I'm going to touch on in my book. But I really wanted to read this as another take on such an important character to my book. I think it's good to get a historian's opinion on what she would have been like as a person. So that's why I chose to read that one. As I said, I've been reading 1,000 Miles Up the Nile. That is the blueprint for half of my book, and Dracula is of course the other blueprint. I've been reading lot number 249 by Arthur Conan Doyle, which was essentially one of the first mummy books. I don't want to have mummies in my book. Mummies are fun to play around with, like, as a character. Like, I'd watch a Scooby-Doo episode with a mummy in it and think, that's cool. But if I was to make a mummy the whole premise of my book, it would feel like I was detracting from the real important history. I think mummies as a concept can be a bit harmful in that they mystify and kind of fetishize ancient history. You know, they make it a marvel rather than being history. Does that make sense? I know there's a word for what I'm thinking of. It's the same as Orientalism. Mystifies the culture in a derogatory way. Anyway, I'm also reading The Natural History of Dragons. Now, I actually bought this because I really like the cover art. I think it's gorgeous. But it ended up being the book that inspired me to write this as diaries. So I was thinking about my own book and I was like, I need to take a break. I want to read something completely different to what I'm writing. Let's just read the new book I bought the other day. And as soon as I opened it, this book is presented as a memoir of an adventurer, which was written in her old age. And it basically recounts how she became an adventurer, and it's really, really interesting. It's a really good book. You should definitely read it. There's a whole series. They're gorgeous books. Look at that. But I started reading that and realised that I really like the idea of it being written post-adventure, kind of reflecting back on what's just happened rather than being written in the moment. So by framing my book like this, it allowed me to kind of bookend it with another character. So I've got a foreword and a conclusion by Edward in the book, which, because he's such a scholar, it felt right to me to have him introduce and conclude the book, which consists of just Robert and Louisa's viewpoints, to then have Edward look over it and, as if he's read the book and gone, this is what I think of the book, regardless of what actually happened inside. Does that make sense? I'm just rambling at this point at camera. But I think it's cool. So that's what's important. So finally, the most important part to me is the casting for my book. After I've come up with any of my characters in anything I write, the first thing I like to do is cast it. So I wrote I started writing a fantasy book last year. Did all of the world building for it, all of the characters, all of the outline, and then just never wrote the book. Which was what I was a bit worried was going to happen with this one as well. But luckily, I followed through and I'm actually writing this one. But I finished casting the book before I even started the outline. By having this group of people, I can much more easily kind of picture how they interact with each other in my head when I'm going, Robert over here, he is married to Louise. So Robert goes back in time and he has to spend time with Hatshepsut, Nughtray and Hekaib, while Louise is forwards in time and she is with Edward and Bahiti. So yeah, it was important to me to get those visuals in my head straight away so I knew exactly what I was looking at, so that if I needed to do any concept art or anything like that, I had a basis for my characters. I can place them visually where I need them. So that was important. So my process moving forwards is going to be to find out what this tomb looks like, because to me, as someone who studied production design, it's very important that a setting is a character. I need to be able to look at a setting and figure out exactly how the characters interact with it, how it affects the story. Yeah, this temple needs to be just as important to my story as Robert and Louise are. Then what I'm going to do is finish my first draft. So I'm writing all of Louisa's bits first, then I'm writing all of Robert's bits, and I'm kind of integrating them into each other, so it'll be Louise, Robert, you know, the whole way through the book. So that it almost works as if we're doing archaeology through the book. So Louise is finding things, going, maybe this is what happened, maybe this is what happened, we'll never know because it was so long ago. And then like 4 chapters later we'll catch up with Robert and he'll be doing what Louise found earlier. So say there was a mural of Robert at a festival and Louise is going, well, we don't know what this festival is for, we don't know if he was sacrificed, you know? And then 4 chapters later Robert's having a party. He's like having the time of his life in ancient Egypt, but Louise is really worried because she's speculating from the future. Yeah, I really like the idea of kind of capturing the inaccuracies in archaeology as well. It's fascinating to me. So yeah, I'm gonna finish off writing that structure. So finish writing Louise's bits, then finish writing Robert's bits, integrate them both together, and then I want to read, before I touch my book again, I want to read from cover to cover 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, and re-edit all of Louise's bits as if they were extracts from that book. And then I'm going to read all of Dracula, again, for like the 6th time, and re-edit all of Robert's bits as if they were from that book. And then layers. Because my book is supposed to have been edited by Edward, I'm going to read a 3rd book. So Lewis and Clark had a book as well. I've only read a couple of extracts from it, so I don't know if this is actually going to be what I use as my reference, but it's just the first thing to pop into my head. So Lewis and Clark wrote a book about their findings when they first got to America, and some of their travels, I think. I don't know much about American history. Lewis and Clark wrote an account of their journeys through America. Again, each of them would write a little bit, and they kind of merged their diaries together. But their particular writing style, from what I've read so far, and I'm not sure I'm going to stick with this because I've never read it before, so I might be way off the mark. But from what I've read so far, I think their kind of combined writing style is what I'd want Edward to look like. So I'm going to go through the book again as if it had been edited by Edward. So to get that sort of 3rd draft polished feel to it, to make everything kind of flow together more smoothly so it doesn't feel so much like 2 people writing it, I'm gonna have 2 very distinct writing styles edited together with a 3rd writing style. That's gonna be so complex, and I'm giving myself more work than I need to, and I don't know how to cut that work down, but I think I want to. I think it would really help with my immersion in the book. I like to really get stuck in, so I'm doing a short history course now all about like life and art in ancient Egypt, which is really cool. It's an online thing done through the Open University. They have some free history courses, so you know, things like that. I've been playing so much Assassin's Creed, so that I can feel a lot more immersed in the world of ancient Egypt. I've been listening to podcasts, I've been watching YouTube videos, I've been really... Every moment that I've not spent at work is spent in my book. And that's the way I really like to write, so that doesn't bother me. I've been finding it absolutely fascinating. Some of the stuff I've been finding out, some of the stories from ancient Egypt, even, you know, just the legends, not even the ones that are supposed to be true, just so much mythology I'd never heard of before. My favourite story so far is going to be quite a prominent one in the book. It's the story of the blind Pharaoh, who supposedly was battling against the Nile after a particularly vicious flood. He threw a spear into the Nile and then went blind for offending the gods. And then 10 years later he was told by an oracle that he could restore his sight by washing his eyes in the urine of a woman who had never cheated on her husband. So he went to a village and he washed his eyes in the urine of about 10 women, including his own wife, and remained blind until the last woman, and when his sight was restored from her, he burnt down the entire village with the other women inside, including his own wife, and then married the woman that made him see again, that restored his sight. So there's an interesting story for you. Just learning about day-to-day life has been absolutely fascinating, as someone who's always focused on kind of the bigger picture and mythology and things like that. It's weird to think about, it's fascinating to think about them as just people, you know, people that were alive 4,000 years ago. So, yeah. I think that's as far as I've got with my book so far, I don't really want to spoil any huge plot points for you, so that's the main premise of Robert getting lost in ancient Egypt and Louise trying to get him back. I think it'll be a fun project. I'm having fun with it so far. So I really want to, yeah, you know what, I want to make this series to kind of document my thought process as I'm going, to document the steps that I'm taking to achieve my vision for the story, the research that I'm partaking in. I think it'll be really interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing the final result. Fingers crossed I'll actually finish this year. That's my goal, is to have at least I want the first draft written by my birthday, is my goal. My birthday's in April, so not long. But I think I can manage that, to be fair, because, as I said, the first draft is just going to be splurge it all down on the page. Exactly what happens to who and when. And then I will fill in all of the emotion, I'll fill in the context, not context, but like historical context. So I'll do more research into Edwardian life and Egyptian life and things like that, and be able to fill in the gaps in what the buildings were like, the clothes, the food, the emotions, things like that. I'll be able to fill out the dynamics a lot more in the second draft. So yeah, first draft done by my birthday, second draft done by the start of summer is my goal. Hopefully get a beta reader to look over it, and then hopefully have my book out by Christmas. Is the goal, I think. I just made that up now, so thank you for listening. If it sounds interesting to you, or if you have any tips, any advice, any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. It'd be good to know if you like this kind of video. Maybe you're just starting on your first book too, and I would really appreciate hearing from some of you who are going through similar stages as me right now and trying to figure out exactly where you're writing. I want to hear if any of the rest of you balance a 9 to 5 with writing, because that's been the most difficult challenge for me so far, is coming home late at night and finding the energy to sit there and write my book. So if anyone has any tips, that'd be good. Yeah, thank you for watching. Bye! This is so embarrassing. I hate being in front of a camera.